Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this first webinar organized by the Quebec CSDFSA Credential Group in collaboration with Finance Montreal and CFA Montreal. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the Finance Montreal website. The Quebec CSDFSA Credential Group is an informal community of practice composed of responsible investment and sustainable development professionals whose purpose is to promote the broad market adoption of SASB reporting standards, as well as to support its broader mission of connecting businesses and investors on the financial impacts of sustainability. SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, is an independent nonprofit standard-setting organization that develops and maintains reporting standards on financially material sustainability information. My name is Anne-Marie Monette. I'm the Senior Director of Responsible Investment at PSP Investments, and I will have the pleasure of being your moderator for today's discussion. Over the next 60 minutes, we will be discussing the role of corporate boards in ESG integration. The first portion of the webinar will allow each of our panelists to present their respective roles and organizations. We will then begin a period of moderated discussion and open up for questions from the audience in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. We invite participants to register their questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. I will now introduce each of our speakers and turn it over to them to present their organization and unique journey into ESG integration. But first, please accept our apologies on behalf of Mr. Desjardins, who unfortunately had to cancel today due to an emergency. So I will start with Tony Donofrio. Tony is Director of Board Engagement and Head of Research at the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance. Matthew Fortier is Vice President Policy at the Institute of Corporate Directors, and Isabelle Laprise is Director and Portfolio Manager, Institutional Management at George L.C. Fraser. Isabelle is also an active member of the Quebec SASDFSA practice community and a SASDFSA credential holder. Tony, the virtual podium is now all yours.
Great, thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and be talking about something other than the pandemic we find ourselves in the midst of. So great to be speaking with you today. CCGG was established in 2003, and we currently have approximately 50 institutional investor members who collectively represent about 4 trillion of investable assets. And so on a collective basis, our members would typically hold an ownership stake of 30% or more in any given Canadian public company. And this provides us with a very powerful platform, which we try to leverage in a few ways. First, we publish guidance on best practices and governance expectations of institutional investors. We've been doing that since the beginning in 2003. We also proactively engage in policy dialogue with regulators, standard setters, and other market participants in the hopes of influencing policy and the regulatory framework in Canada. And since 2009, we've been also trying to leverage our platform through direct engagement with the boards of Canadian public companies. I joined CCGG in 2010. Prior to that time, I had spent 20 years in the corporate finance and investment banking industry. And for most of the last 10 years, I've been responsible for leading the organization's board engagement program and its research efforts. So on an annual basis, we engage directly with the boards of approximately 40 Canadian public companies, and this is through private one-on-one meetings. At a high level, the primary objective of our engagement is to communicate the views of institutional shareholders on governance and oversight matters. And the focus has always been on governance squarely. And up until about 2 years ago, CCGG didn't really delve into the area of E&S oversight particularly, other than to discuss the risk implications with board members of various environmental or social factors. And so in 2018, as many of you likely are aware, CCGG published guidance, particularly a document called the Director's Handbook, the E&S Handbook. And that's been well received in the marketplace. It was an attempt to really put some guidance out there as to what investors are expecting in terms of the quality and comprehensiveness of issuer reporting and what boards should be, at least in the minds of institutional investors, focused on when it comes to E&S considerations. So it's clear that I think to the topic of this webinar, it's clear that our members feel that boards have a critical role to play in ensuring that ESG considerations are appropriately integrated within the organizations that they oversee.
Thank you for that, Tony. Now, Matthew, would you like to share some of ICD's work also with regards to ESG integration?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me to this discussion today. By way of background, the Institute of Corporate Directors counts 15,000 members across the country. We've got 11 chapters in every major center across Canada. In Quebec, EIS is a prominent organization that includes some of the most experienced directors in the province. Our membership really is made up of, yes, public company directors, but also large private companies, family businesses, large not-for-profits, hospital sector, universities, etc., and crown corporations. I think it's fair to say in the last few years, E&S have become critical areas of focus for most boards in the country, particularly those in certain sectors, extractive sectors, financial services, and others. But of course, it started really, I would say, with a broader discussion around gender diversity, which has been evolving into kind of broader diversity criteria, and now has really been focused on climate and sustainability. To the point where, look, most shareholder proposals last year were climate change related, and pretty much every sector in our economy faces material risks from climate change. Because frankly, all of our key sectors contribute to climate change, whether it be oil and gas, transportation, agriculture, et cetera, or they're financially exposed to those industries. So, the good news is that, our members are aware of this. They're aware of the challenges facing their industries, their companies in the country. In November of last year, so what is that, 5 months ago, our latest survey showed that 1,000 corporate directors answered the survey, and they identified as climate change and sustainability as the most pressing risk facing Canada over the next 15 years. So, awareness is there. It's largely been driven by institutional investors and groups such as Tony's, CCGG, raising the alarm not only around the challenges here, but also sort of demanding more information and more transparency. So, look, the good news is that the E part of the equation is a long-term focus for most boards. I think a big challenge that we might discuss today, but certainly will need to be discussed over the coming weeks and months is the S part of this. So what we're experiencing right now with COVID-19, risks sort of overtaking some of the dialogue in the public's mind away from the longer term challenges around sustainability. We've got huge financial disruption. Obviously, a lot of people are facing unemployment. A lot of companies are facing things like restructuring and massive layoffs. So there are going to be some societal impacts there that boards and senior managers are going to have to think through. So, you've got an imperative when it comes to the environment and climate change and sustainability. But you have another imperative that is shorter term that is going to be competing for some attention. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to watch out for. And that's something that the ICD is keenly aware of. And I'll finish there and look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you, Matthew. And certainly we'll come back to a lot of these topics over the course of our discussion. I'll turn over now to Isabelle for our introduction before we start our Q&A.
Yes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I am with Jarislowski Fraser, and I have been there since last October. Previously, I was working at the Caisse de dépôt et placements Québec for almost 20 years. And during my time at the Caisse, I worked with the equity research team and with the responsible investment team. With the responsible investment team, I learned a lot about ESG. I did proxy voting, engagement with board of director, engagement with Tony, and I did many ESG analysis of companies based on their public disclosures. And the public disclosures of material ESG information is key, and this is something I will stress today. So as I mentioned, I am now at Jarvis Lusky Fraser, where I have two main responsibilities. I work with clients as a director and a portfolio manager in the institutional team, and I am also on the ESG committee. This committee supports the firm implementation of our sustainable investment policy. The committee also supports the ESG integration by the global research team, and I will come back to this responsibility in a moment. For those of you who don't know Jarvis Lusky Fraser, we are an asset manager that was founded in 1955. We are based in Montreal. We are a PRI signatory. At the end of our last fiscal year, we had $42 billion of assets under management. We are mainstream. Our investment decisions are based on fundamental research. We have a long-term investment horizon, and by long-term, I mean at least 7 to 10 years. And we focus on quality. And by quality, we define quality by good governance, by quality management, by competitive position, by financial strength, by attractive valuation. Our approach is proprietary and leverages our 65 years of experience. Our global research team at JF is responsible for ESG integration, and this is very important. It is important to note that at JF, at Jarvis Lusky Fraser, ESG integration is not a product. ESG applies to every company and it applies to every portfolio. How we do that? We have a number of tools. We use governance as a pillar. So as a founding member of CCGG, governance has always been a focus for us. And to define materiality, to define what is important, we use SASB to define what is important in terms of E and S. For the purpose of today's discussion, the role of corporate boards in ESG integration is key. And I want to make 2 points. I want to make 2 points here. The first is that material ESG issues required board oversight. And the second is that corporate boards must include material ESG issues in governance structures. And by governance structures, I mean systems and processes.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for this very insightful overview. And a lot of you touched on the current environment, and not to bring us back to the pandemic, but I thought it was important to perhaps come back and place today's discussion in the environment we are facing. And the pandemic is bringing a renewed focus on the relationship between a company and its ecosystem, including all its stakeholders. Strong governance and business continuity continue to be at the forefront while companies look to build redundancy in the supply chain while keeping their employees also and customers safe. And several of these issues surface the importance of ESG factors in corporate priorities and board oversight. Investors, as Isabel just mentioned on their end, also increasingly adopting a responsible investment approach. And in doing so, they may face different challenges. You touched on it briefly on materiality, Isabel. To achieve ESG integration. So this brings me to my first question for you, Isabel. Before we come back to your personal experience as an investor, what in your opinion has been driving the rise of responsible investment interest in the investment community in the past 2 years?
Yes, so first, before answering the question, I would just like to take a minute to define what we mean by integrating ESG. Integrating ESG means accounting for environmental, social, and governance issues. For investors, this means integration into the investment process. For companies, this means integration into business strategy, managerial decisions, plannings, systems. Considerations will differ depending on the industry. So for a beverage company, water management is key. For a petroleum company, greenhouse gas emissions are key. For a bank, data security is key. In the past, issues like this have not been covered by regular financial disclosures. So now, why this rising trend in responsible investing? There are a number of factors that explain the rise in responsible investing. I made a small list here, and there is probably more. The first factor is the adoption of responsible policies by both asset owners and asset managers. Often, this is correlated with them being a PRI signatory. And with, I think, close to 3,000 signatories, this is a lot of interest for responsible investing. So this is the first factor. The second factor is the increased awareness of topics like diversity and climate change. For example, climate change cannot be considered alone. Climate change must include other considerations like biodiversity, land use, water use, urbanization. So this is the second factor. The third factor is the increased regulation for both investors and companies. This applies to disclosures. This also applies to issues like sugar content in food and beverages, the use of plastics, energy emissions, human rights, and so on. The fourth factor accounting for the increased focus of responsible investing has to do with man-made disasters. An oil spill is an obvious example. One other example is the collapse of the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh in 2013, when more than 1,000 workers in the garment sector died. Despite this tragic loss, one positive resulted from it, and it is the increased awareness of the increased oversight of supply chains. So now both investors and companies ask more questions about the supply chain, and hopefully this will lead to better working conditions. A final factor is the proposition by institutional investors to put more emphasis on long-termism. And by long-termism, I mean being a shareholder for many years being a shareholder for many years and having a long-term as opposed to a short-term perspective.
It's interesting. If I can come back to a point you made on integration, in your seat as an investor, are you able to really assess what goes on in the day-to-day, how companies are integrating these factors into their policies and practices?
In terms of investor expectations, in terms of expectation, we have I have three things. First, I would like to see more relevant information. Second, I would like to see a closer link between a company's strategy, a company's long-term strategies, and its approach to ESG. And third, I would like to see more connection with financial data. And to get these things, I would expect that a company has identified the ESG factors relevant to the strategy. I would expect also that the company's approach the company's approach is transparent and clearly explained. I would expect also that the ESG factors it has identified are put in context as to why they are important, why they have been chosen. These factors should be supported by both quantitative and qualitative factors. And data should be standardized so it is easier to make comparison with peers. We have to remind that one of the challenges for investors is to quantify ESG factor. So based on what I just said, I would like to have information that provides a strong link between the material ESG factor and their financial impact for the company. And I would also like to remind that an ESG analysis is only as useful and relevant as the information upon which it is based. And so this is why we need great disclosures.
Thank you, Isabel. Tony, I'd like to turn it over to you, and not to put you on the spot, but Isabel has fleshed out a very thorough framework for us. I'd be curious to get your perception of the different levels of knowledge of institutional investors as it comes to ESG, and also are you seeing in your experience inconsistencies in what they may ask in terms of ESG related actions and reporting?
Sure. Yeah, first I wanted to pick up on a point that Isabel made, which is that, you know, to your question on what's driving this trend that we're seeing, because I've been asked that question a number of times by directors of some of the companies that we meet with. And the answer is really that it also reflects a rising expectation on the part of their stakeholders. And so it doesn't matter if your stakeholders are pensioners, endowment funds, individuals, or whomever, all class of institutional investor, I would say, is expected by their stakeholders to be increasing their focus on factors which I would say have not historically been that prominent in traditional investment decision-making processes. And so to answer your question, you know, institutional investors, depending on the scale of the organization and the resources they have, are really at different levels of sophistication and have different levels of resources available in-house to address this challenge of doing a more comprehensive job in terms of considering E&S factors. And so it's similar to the challenge that boards are facing, and many institutional investors are really still evolving their practices and figuring out how to best integrate E&S considerations into their businesses. So I think it's important for directors to know that that's likely the cause of you know, some of the different questioning you get depending on who you're speaking with in the institutional investor community. So given that, I don't think currently there's a definitive answer to, you know, sort of what do investors want or expect. I think there are a range of views out there. I think at a high level, investors want to ensure that boards and management teams are devoting an appropriate level of resources, time, and attention to understanding the potential implications of these various E&S factors we talk about, like climate change and others, for their business specifically, and they want that reflected in their corporate strategy. It should be obvious through their communication of their corporate strategy that those factors are considered, as well as how they operate the business on a day-to-day basis. And from a disclosure standpoint, I can say that global standards published by the likes of SASB and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, have gained significant traction within our member base and the investment community generally. And so I think those are very good references for directors and boards to look to, and we certainly bring that up when we're meeting with directors in our engagement meetings.
Thank you. Max, it's interesting to come back to some of Tony's points. What has been the impact of this rise of ESG, so this focus on ESG for your members at the board level? And perhaps, I mean, has there been a change in either board discussions? And is there some frustration also from the part of your members? Do they feel investors are focusing on the right factors? I'd be curious to get your perspective on that front.
So I guess the answer is yes to all of the above. You know, Tony described a variance in sophistication amongst his members and certainly across the investor community. And it's true in the board community as well, right? So obviously large cap companies with sophisticated and experienced board members, lots of resources, have the ability to focus on this a little bit more and to get further ahead. And that's true really across all industries in our country. Smaller companies, smaller cap, mid cap companies that, you know, the current environment aside, are always going to be looking to keep the lights on. And often the directors are also the people who go out into the field with their heavy boots, right? So they are a little bit behind. But I will say that the the investor focus to your question has really kind of brought the E&S discussion directly into the boardrooms of Canada, regardless of whether it's the dominant discussion or a less dominant one. It is being discussed. When I started in my current role, the dynamic between the investment community and directors really was around issues like executive compensation or pure financial performance, and I think that has changed. Diversity has really been a bit of a game changer. The conversation, we're not where we need to be in Canada, clearly, but at least we're on the right trajectory, even if it's a slow trajectory, and now increasingly around climate sustainability. So it is on board agendas. There is more attention being paid to this. As I said, more sophisticated boards, the ones with, and frankly, the ones with more to lose if they don't get this right, are attuned to this. They are doing their high-level risk management assessments. They are figuring out, what the materiality looks like in the event of extreme weather events, et cetera, and they are demanding more and more information from their management teams and more planning, and they are being, more transparent than they ever have been. And I think, as I said before, they're on the right trajectory. The task now is to get everybody up to speed, right? And that's something that the ICD is focused on, whether it's through our formal education or our webinars or our magazine or the hundreds of events we do across the country every year, to bring best practices and best learnings to our members. I will just also say, and I think I said it in my opening, it is starting, right? So, another survey we did, 31% of our members said that, they were beginning to incorporate UN SDGs into their strategic planning, which was a bit of a surprise even for us. But that's a really good thing. It's a bit abstract in terms of how they're doing it and which SDGs they're focused on. But the fact that they sort of see a purpose beyond just making money and sort of see the impact that their business has on their society is a positive.
Maybe a question for all three of you now. So I'm listening to your comments about the training, changes to your curriculum. Do you feel that we're going to need to build new skill sets at the board level to better address, monitor, understand these ESG issues? Do we need to have also maybe a dedicated function at the board level to take over governance and responsibility? Maybe starting with Tony in your engagement activities, have you seen in the current state some challenges at the board level to integrate some of the ESG issues? And do you think that, or do you see that evolving over time? Do you think we will need to integrate new skill sets?
Sure. Well, I first I want to say I can sympathize with some of what we hear from the director community. I've heard it directly, and Matthew has referred to it as well, I think, a little bit, and that is, the wave of investor interest has come on strong, and it can seem at times like, the pendulum has swung too far in one direction, or some come away with that impression as directors sometimes that investors seem to be focusing more so on some of these ESG factors to the exclusion of other important traditional business factors. But I just want to say that I don't believe institutional investors have lost sight at all of their primary purpose, which is really to generate financial returns for their stakeholders. So I think to the extent there's confusion out there, it can be bridged by greater and more regular dialogue between directors and shareholders. But coming to your point on challenges that might be facing boards, I think there are a variety of factors that impact how equipped a board is to address and integrate ESG considerations. And those factors would include, what the composition of the board is, the relative levels of education and expertise of existing directors in these areas, the quality and extent of historical reporting that they receive from their management teams, and how clearly responsibility for key areas is allocated amongst members of the senior management team. So some of the younger companies that we speak with, including entrepreneur-founded businesses that are new to the public markets, they're just not used to dealing with public shareholders, and they've, in many cases, just not formally established their oversight and reporting frameworks, certainly to the extent that investors expect. And so I think it's important that we and individual investors recognize that companies are at different states of evolution and have different capacity, if you will, to address these issues as thoroughly as perhaps some of the larger cap, longer standing names. And it takes some work on the part of the board. So I think also, as we said earlier, the fact that institutional investors' practices are also evolving means the boards don't really have clear direction from the marketplace just yet. And, CCGG issued the ENS guidebook in part to try and assist boards in defining and establishing best practices and what they should be doing.
Thank you. On best practices, to stay on that topic, Isabelle, as an investor, you've been meeting with several management teams over the course of your career. How do you help them ramp up on best practices? Do you recommend training on sustainability for directors? Or are there other best practices that you've been recommending?
Yeah, of course, training is a good idea. In terms of best practices, first of all, most people know that it is more difficult to find and to use ESG information than it is to find and to use traditional financial data. So, and this is because the framework for traditional financial data is more advanced, is more mature. One recommendation for board of director is to look at SASB. So we already talked about SASB. They can also use the ENS guidebook provided by CCGG. We have to remind that ESG reporting should be made in connection with the rest of the business. And to help that, relevant ESG factors should be included in existing governance structures, like I said at the beginning, into systems and processes. And to come back to the point about the focus of ESG, the focus on ESG. In my opinion, I don't think investors are too much focused on ESG. Actually, shareholders must focus more on ESG. And why? I think we are a little lost here and about what is important. And I understand why, with the increased importance of ESG, there is a lot of information, approaches, products. It can get confusing, like for both investors and companies. Even for me, sometimes I'm like, So I believe it is the responsibility of everyone to do more work in connection with ESG and to define what is important. And I would say that the board should get involved. They should get involved into the process. They should take ownership of the process, them and their management team.
Matthew, to stay on the board, Isabelle has talked about integrating sustainability in processes and systems. Is there a strong view at the ICD level in terms of who should be in charge of the sustainability function? Should it be a board subcommittee? Should it be compliance, legal? What is your perspective on that?
So, look, I think it needs to be a whole of enterprise endeavor, right? So boards do play a critical role here, and you're seeing more boards form sustainability committees, for example. You're seeing, really sort of top class boards getting better information, getting better briefings, becoming more educated, sourcing directors with more experience in some of the issues that you would sort of broadly term ESG. But again, and I think it's important to sort of point out that Canada really is a small and a medium-sized enterprise-driven economy, right? So you've got some very big companies that can really think through this stuff and can get great directors to think. And and that's great news. The challenge is going to be getting, the rest of the country up to speed. And it is slowly, I will say, I think, we've been heartened by the number of people who've reached out to us for more information. And it's not just sort of, what do we need to get through this year? It's really, we want to get better at this. We want to understand what the requirements are. We want to understand what the investment community expects from us, because it works both ways. We also hear that actually when investors do want to talk to us, they want to talk about our performance. They want to talk about how we compensate people, et cetera, et cetera. They don't have a lot of questions around sustainability. So, there's still kind of an engagement exercise to be had between, the issuer community and boards and their investors to understand what the expectations are so that you can get to that level of, should we be using SASB, for instance? Should we be using another model? A lot of boards aren't there yet because they don't really know what's expected of them. And that's not, that's partly their fault. That's partly the investor's fault. It's partly just the way that things have evolved. And so I think we can all do a better job of building a little bit more certainty and clarity into this system for everybody. Because, at the end of the day, everybody wants to be reporting and being more transparent around this. I don't think anybody's trying to hide anything. But to sort of sum up, I think that there has been a lot of movement, particularly in big boards, to get more skilled, more knowledge. The challenge now is to sort of spread that across the system.
And in terms of spreading that across the system, how does one establish the right tone at the top? And I guess this ties back to the issue of executive compensation. And maybe a question for you and Tony. Do you, we are seeing increasing investor demand in terms of increasing ENS metrics in executive compensation. Do you feel that is an important component of setting the right tone at the top? And are there challenges in integrating these metrics into traditional compensation structures? I don't know if Tony, you wanted to start on that one.
You want me to start? Sure. Yeah. Well, I just want to begin by saying this is something we pay very close attention to, compensation structures, for obvious reasons. We see it as the primary means of influencing management behavior. It obviously has an effect on the overall culture of the organization as well. And for that reason, we've had guidance out there for a number of years on executive compensation generally. I would say the traditional challenges of determining appropriate metrics for a comp structure, including which measures tie best to your strategic objectives, how accurately and objectively they can be measured, and how much influence or impact your management team has over that metric, and for a fourth one, what the appropriate weighting is. Those are all considerations for any metric, including whether it's appropriate and if it is, to what extent you introduce sustainability metrics. I think there is a view out there that when something becomes important, let's just add another metric to the comp structure to reflect that. And you can do that to a point, and then it loses its impact because you're asking your management team to consider and to keep in mind, if you will, maybe too many factors at one time. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have ENS metrics in compensation structures, but I do think that a board needs to decide that, following a comprehensive review of, what the most important things are that drive their business. And, if it's not explicitly a weighted factor in an STIP or an LTIP plan, that doesn't mean that you can't hold individual members of your management team responsible on a personal level, or for that matter, impact the culture of the company and still have a focus on important ENS objectives. I think Isabel mentioned it earlier, but investors would ideally like companies within the same industry to have some commonality in terms of the metrics used in their compensation structures, as well as how they calculate and report those metrics, so that there's an opportunity to compare performance across an industry.
Perhaps Matthew or Isabel, have you also noticed the trend in terms of ENS integration compensation structure? Do you have a strong view on the importance of that integration in the future?
I'll just briefly start. You know, one of the things I do in my spare time is I'm the executive director of the Canadian Foundation for Governance Research, and we had some research done last year around you know, compensation, CSR and compensation. So to replace the term CSR for sustainability, or you know, ESG, and you know, the verdict really is still out on how effective this is. You know, there are a lot of factors. Tony identified some of this as well. I mean, you know, how involved is management in setting some of these metrics up, and you know, how boilerplate, for lack of a better term, does this become, so that it's easily achieved, and you know, it's the right conversation to be had. I haven't seen a lot that says it's been terribly effective to date, and part of that is because we're probably still starting on this journey, but it's definitely, as I say, the right conversation to be had. I think you can put some KPIs around this. I think you can compensate people and incentivize people on factors beyond just pure financial performance and earnings. But I haven't seen a lot of evidence sort of saying that this is the magic bullet so far.
It's interesting on KPIs, perhaps, Isabel, both as an investor to drive ESG integration, and for companies who are looking to integrate ENS metrics in their compensation structure. Do you feel that we have the right tools in place to really measure sustainability performance? Do we need more standardized reporting? And perhaps also, do we need third-party assurance of the data? What have you noticed in terms of recent trends?
Okay, do we have the right tool? This is a good question. Tools are evolving, but we still have to be creative, I would say. So here, we already talked about SASB, and I think SASB play an important role in standardization. And SASB can help both investors and companies. So this is what I like a lot from SASB, and I am using SASB a lot in my work. Just quickly, maybe on SASB. SASB has developed a complete set of standards for 77 industries. It has a strong evidence-based approach. It focuses on materiality, and it explains the link between ESG factors and financial considerations. So there are other tools for investors. So for example, we see tools provided by UNPRI and other service providers. What we have to keep in mind when we are using those tools is that they all come from a different methodology, and we have to understand what they are accounting for. So do we have the right tool? Yes and no. As I mentioned at the beginning, tools are evolving, and I think they are evolving for the great. But we still have to work together and to be involved to get better disclosures.
And it's interesting, we do have a question coming from participants, and maybe I'll turn it over to Tony. When you meet with boards in your engagement activities, how do you go about presenting them or encouraging them to adopt a specific framework, given the multiplicity of frameworks? Isabel talked about SASB, but there's also GRI, TCFD. So what's your approach to educating board members in these different frameworks? And maybe we'll ask the same question to Matthew after.
Sure. Well, so far, I mean, I would say that's evolving probably too. So far, and I would say for the last year or so, we've been alerting boards on this topic generally. We've been providing some general guidance along the following lines. One is that, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, SASB's framework and the TCFD framework, which we think are complementary, are two reporting frameworks that seem to be resonating with institutional shareholders broadly. And that's not to say that that's the end of the discussion on, what's appropriate for a reporting framework, but we certainly hear that a lot. And so we've been passing that along to boards, because boards are often thinking about, well, we need to undertake a review of how we report things and what we report. And so we encourage them, for the reasons that Isabel's already mentioned. It gets down to very narrow industry definitions. There's materiality standard in there. So we think it's a good tool. The other point that we pass along, which is not really so much related to disclosure, but I wanted to mention it anyway, is we are telling boards that, investors are often looking to third-party organizations like MSCI or Sustainalytics and the reports that they generate in informing themselves on a company's E&S record and performance. And so as board members, they should be on top of that. Management teams as well, of course. They should be on top of what's being said out there by the third-party advisors that are informing, in many cases, the views of institutional investors.
That's interesting, and we have a follow-up on that from participants for Matthew. So what strategies can a corporate board use to ensure that the key S&G factors important to its business are made known to the general public, as to enable stakeholders to make informed judgments about the company's ESG integration?
So, what we've been talking about, sort of the transparency around reporting, whether it's using a SASB framework or another of the various and very good models that exist out there. I think that the board's role here is obviously one of oversight. So, I think it's important for boards to understand what is expected of them from their stakeholders, primarily their shareholders, not just their shareholders, because, obviously the difference in Canada between us and the US and many parts of the world is that, directors owe a duty to the corporation, not solely to the shareholder. And so, they have to understand what stakeholders expect of them and be transparent with those stakeholders. And then, assure themselves that there is a mechanism internally with management to get the right information flowing to the board and back to management, right? And then out to that stakeholder community. So, what I would say is there has been a measure of confusion in the market, particularly in the issuer community, around which model to use, whether it's SASB or another one. Again, acknowledging that these are really strong models that exist, but, the World Economic Forum has got, their perspective, the UN's got their perspective, there are various sort of reporting mechanisms that exist. And so I think, just like in every other conversation, business wants some predictability, they do want that here too. And so I think if you were to ask, the average board director, what do you do? And they'll say, we'll do whatever you want us to do, but we need to do it consistently. We need to have consistency from you in terms of what you want from us. So, I would say that it's twofold. Understand what the market expects of you, what your stakeholders expect of you, and then implement a mechanism internally to get that information flowing from management.
And where do we draw the line? What is not in the board mandate in terms of ENS oversight? And this is a question maybe for all of you.
Well, I'll start. I'll sort of say, look, again, just to reiterate that, directors don't manage the company. And so, at the end of the day, you have to let your management team do what they're going to do. You do need to, have close oversight. You do need to ensure you understand what they're doing, and you need to hold them accountable for that. But you need to empower them to make business decisions and business operational decisions. So, nothing is not, part of their oversight duty. The board will, at the end of the day, decide what it is they think is a priority. But at the end of the day, they'll empower the management team and have to, or else the company won't run effectively.
Isabel, I think you had a comment also to add.
Yeah, I agree with what Matthew just said, and it may be difficult to draw the line where the board's mandates end, where the board's mandate ends. But I think if something is relevant to the long-term strategy, the board has to make sure that it is part of the strategy, you know. So it has to make sure that it empowers the management team with the effective tool. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the board should get involved in the process and be aware of what are the material ESG factors, because this will enable them to fulfill their responsibility of oversight and of shareholder engagement.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, sorry, Anne-Marie, it's Tony. I was just going to mention, I agree with Matthew's definition, but I think what's important is that board need to demonstrate that they're providing that effective oversight and holding management accountable. And I think they're doing that increasingly through engaging in dialogue with their shareholders. But it's still, you know, the information circular is still sort of a critical document for boards to communicate to shareholders what they're doing and how they're actively carrying out their responsibilities, and that applies to you know, to this subject matter as well, I would say.
Thank you. And going back to an earlier question, and I don't think we reached a conclusion on the need for third-party assurance, but you mentioned the disclosure in the circular. Tony, do you have a strong opinion on that?
Well, you know, I think investors would love any opportunity they can get to have third-party objective vetting of, you know, the reporting they receive from corporate boards. I don't know how viable that is. It depends on the subject matter. You know, we, not to digress, but CCGG published a paper recently on the use of non-GAAP measures, and that's another area where it's desperately in need or would benefit from, to the extent it's possible, third-party vetting. But coming back to ENS, you know, I think that's an ideal to shoot for. I'm not sure whether it can be attainable in all cases.
So we're almost up on the hour, and I'd love perhaps to close with a question for all three of you. We're obviously going through some exceptional times that are prone to perhaps shift board priorities in the interest of preserving business continuity. So do you feel that the current crisis may shift the focus on ENS on the board's agenda? Or do you feel that it may in fact raise their importance? So maybe starting with Isabelle.
Yeah, so for us, I think ESG remains top of mind, because I think a lot about what is happening today with COVID-19 is about ESG. So it's about employees, supply chain, communities, connectivity, and safety and integrity of the operations, being more efficient, innovation, and even if we don't call those ESG, they are ESG. So for sure, we still talk about ESG with our company. We have a great deal of dialogue with them, and we talk about those issues, and we talk a lot about employees for sure.
Thank you. Tony?
Well, I was just going to mention that, you know, boards sometimes talk about how, you know, in their risk and strategy discussions, they talk about black swan events and consider their implications for the organization that they oversee. And, you know, arguably, what we're in the middle of right now is a black swan event, or we hope it is. And, you know, some boards do that. Some boards, I think, aren't doing that yet, but maybe a situation like we're in now will prompt them to do that more so in the future. And so I don't think this will shift at all the focus away from ESG. As Isabella said, I think it'll probably put even a greater spotlight on it.
Thank you. Matthew, we'll finish with you.
Yeah, so I agree with what my two colleagues said, I would maybe put a slightly different sheen on it. I think you're looking at two kind of existential issues that are existing at the same time. One we've really known about for decades, but one we sort of acted on over the last few years and has become part of, every business discussion. And one is sudden and unforeseen and is a black swan, of the greatest magnitude. But they're both about sustainability and survivability. And I think you've got right now two parallel discussions. How do we survive one so that we can survive the other, so that we can continue talking about the survivability of our company and of our economy, I will say I would expect that boards will be distracted over the coming weeks and months. I just think it's going to be unavoidable. I don't think that pushes ESG, particularly climate sustainability, off the agenda, but it probably does make it, number two on the agenda, as it were, for some time. Does that sort of slow down progress? It might, and that's unfortunate. But obviously, most boards, look, their job is to keep the lights on. Their job is to make sure that the company survives. So they've got to get through this short-term crisis first, so they can get back to dealing with the longer one.
Well, that's real. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all your valuable comments. And I hope we have an opportunity to have this discussion again once the crisis has passed to reassess where we are in our ESG journey. But and also thank you to the entire SASB FSA Credential Group for their support in organizing this event, as well as our partners, Finance Montreal and CFA Montreal. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the questions and for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.